Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Do you remember the case of Alexander Smirnov? That's the guy who said he'd heard directly from the owners of Burisma, Hunter Biden's Ukrainian energy company, that Burisma had bribed Joe and Hunter Biden. He was arrested in February of this year for allegedly lying about the dates when he heard about the bribe. Well, through him, we are now able to open a whole new can of worms, specifically how Ukrainian elites and oligarchs plundered that country in the years when Joe Biden was the viceroy or de facto leader of Ukraine between 2014 and 2017. It was through Smirnov's case that the plundering came into focus, because it was Smirnov who helped the FBI arrest the chief executive of a bank that was at the center of the plundering. Alexander Smirnov has been in the news because he supposedly lied about when he was told about bribes that were allegedly paid to Joe and Hunter Biden. We reported on his case previously and also reported why we think he may not have lied at all. We don't want to retell that story. The reason why we mention it at all is that through his story, we were able to unearth a completely different scandal, which may well be even bigger. You see, one of Smirnov's defenses is that he had been a hugely reliable FBI source for many years in many different matters, and that the Biden story was just a tiny part of his work for the FBI. Well, one of those other matters that Smirnov worked on was an alleged money laundering scam involving an Austrian bank called Meinl Bank. Meinl Bank is alleged to have helped Ukrainian oligarchs move billions of dollars into various offshore locations. So where does Smirnov come in? Well, the FBI wanted to arrest Peter Weinzierl, the former chief executive of Meinl Bank, and Smirnov allegedly helped them do just that. Weinzierl was arrested by authorities in the United Kingdom in May of 2021 at the behest of the Department of Justice and the FBI. Now, the only reason he was in the United Kingdom where he could be arrested is because Smirnov had allegedly lured him there under a false pretext. Now, we say alleged because this is still a developing story. Peter Weinzierl immediately smelled a rat and started fighting his extradition to the United States, claiming that he had been entrapped, specifically that a U.S. law enforcement agent had lured him to the United Kingdom. DOJ and FBI denied that anything like that had happened, and so a UK judge initially ruled that Weinzierl had not been lured. But all that has now changed. With the unmasking of Smirnov in connection with his arrest and the Biden bribery matter, it is now publicly known that Smirnov was indeed an FBI undercover informant and that Weinzierl's suspicions were correct all along. We'll get to the Ukraine part in a moment, but just wanted to emphasize that this is why it was so extremely unusual that Smirnov was charged in the first place. Because as soon as that happened, his cover story and his role as confidential informant was blown. There are already reports that other people, aside from Weinzierl, are now also coming forward to claim that they too were entrapped. The fact that Smirnov was charged with lying only makes it worse, because all the people who were supposedly entrapped can now claim that he also lied in their cases. So the bottom line is that a lot of totally unrelated cases are now in jeopardy just because someone decided to give Biden a huge public win by charging Smirnov on tenuous grounds. But let's leave that aside. What caught our attention in this story is Meinl Bank, the bank that Weinzierl headed, which stands accused of facilitating money laundering. Now, the official reason why Weinzierl was arrested has to do with money laundering through a Brazilian construction company. But when we looked into the weeds of the story, we found that Meinl Bank's Ukraine activities were far more worthy of the FBI's attention. To be fair, Ukrainian money laundering may also have been on the FBI's radar, but that issue was somehow dropped for one reason or another, we can't be sure. Ultimately, we do not know why the Ukrainian money laundering was not pursued. It was certainly not for lack of evidence. Piecing together various reports from Ukraine over the years, reports which did not receive wide attention elsewhere, it appears as if Minel Bank had a central role in facilitating the looting of Ukrainian banks during the years of Biden's stewardship over Ukraine. Biden came to power in February of 2014 when the then Ukrainian government was expelled and replaced by a puppet that had been chosen by State Department official Victoria Nuland with Biden's blessing. From that time until January of 2017, Biden was informally in charge of Ukraine, and he made many trips there. Biden was constantly on the phone telling Ukraine's leaders what to do. In his final month in office, Biden ordered Ukraine's president to nationalize Ukraine's biggest lender, a bank called PrivatBank. Biden's stated reason was that he did not want Trump to find out how badly undercapitalized that bank was and that Ukraine would need more financial injections. A few days after Biden's call, PrivatBank was nationalized just as Biden had ordered. The thinking was that by not drawing attention to Ukraine immediately, more payments would flow. And this gets us to the heart of the matter. The influx of money into Ukraine after the February 2014 Nuland and Biden coup is just staggering. First, in April of 2014, which was the same month that Hunter Biden was hired by corrupt Ukrainian energy company Burisma, the IMF approved a $17 billion standby arrangement for Ukraine, with $3.2 billion for immediate disbursement. Barely 11 months later, in March of 2015, the IMF approved another $17.5 billion with $5 billion for immediate disbursement. The money that Biden put on hold pending the firing of the prosecutor who was investigating Burisma was part of those monies that were given to Ukraine at that time, which just goes to show you how much sway he had over these payments. More money came from the World Bank, other financial institutions, and directly from the United States and other countries. So, what was all that money for? A lot of it was for Ukrainian elites and oligarchs who funneled huge amounts overseas. While corruption had always been a long-standing problem for Ukraine, things just went into overdrive with the injection of tens of billions of dollars after 2014. After all, however much corruption you have in your country, it is limited by the overall amount of money available. So if you start with a highly corrupt environment and then start injecting billions and billions of dollars, you're just going to get more corruption. In other words, the scale of corruption just took off. And this gets us back to Minel Bank. A lot of the money that was being pumped into Ukraine was siphoned off by oligarchs, elites, and corrupt officials. But they didn't just keep the money in Ukraine. That would have been too risky because the money could be seized or traced. Plus, the money was of little use over there, so a scheme was devised to get the money into offshore accounts. The scheme was what is called an insider lending operation, which means that a bank loans money to its own officers or directors. The scheme went as follows. First of all, the incoming IMF money was used to prop up Ukrainian banks. According to the then IMF president, Christine Lagarde, the injection of so much liquidity was supposed to have been used for bold economic programs to secure macroeconomic and financial stability. But that is not what happened. A year after Lagarde said those words, Ukrainian banks were worse off than ever. How did that happen? Well, the scheme went like this. The money injected into Ukraine went into oligarch-owned Ukrainian banks. And then those banks opened what are called correspondent accounts at foreign banks, such as Minel Bank in Austria. So the Ukrainian bank would open a correspondent account at a foreign bank on behalf of someone with clout, in many cases the bank's owner. The foreign bank would then loan the amount deposited by the Ukrainian bank to some offshore entity, which was owned or controlled by whichever person in Ukraine happened to be running the scheme. With the foreign bank acting as a sort of middleman, the money was no longer directly connected to Ukraine, and that made it much more difficult to trace, although the Pandora Papers leak in 2021 did reveal that Ukrainian elites and oligarchs had funneled the money to places like Cyprus and Belize. Many Ukrainian banks became insolvent by participating in this scheme. That not only meant that the money injected by the IMF and others was gone, but it also meant that the money deposited by locals was gone. That sort of thing is absolutely terrible for an economy. Now, to be clear, insider lending isn't new, and it wasn't new in 2014. The point is that the injection of so much money during Biden's tenure massively increased the scale of corruption. Take Privatbank, for instance. We already mentioned that that was the bank that Joe Biden demanded needed to be nationalized in late 2016, just as he was about to leave office, because he didn't want Trump to ask questions. Well, Privatbank was owned by Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. He used the scheme to embezzle upwards of $2 billion of IMF money. Strangely, Biden never talks about that. Recall that Biden fired Ukraine's chief prosecutor Viktor Shokin? The official reason, as belatedly parroted by the New York Times, was that Ukrainian prosecutors, not Shokin himself but other people, have been found with $400,000 in cash as well as a dozen diamonds. Well, even if we were to accept this official narrative, what these prosecutors are alleged to have done pales in comparison to what Kolomoisky actually did. So why was there no interest in him? Well, for one thing, he was the guy who funded the presidential campaign of Volodymyr Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine. So let's sum up. After the 2014 coup, tens of billions of dollars were sent to Ukraine. But as fast as it was being sent, it was transferred by corrupt bank owners and oligarchs to offshore companies via banks like Meinl Bank. The money was eventually embezzled by loan defaults by shell companies. Between 2014 and 2015, at least 62 Ukrainian banks became insolvent. A further 36 banks became insolvent between 2015 and 2017. In total, nearly 100 banks folded during the time that Joe Biden was in charge of Ukraine between 2014 and 2017. That is probably one of the most underreported facts in the entire Ukraine saga. And to be honest, we too weren't fully aware of the extent of it until we found out about Smirnov's role in taking down the chief executive of Meinl Bank. Which brings us back to Peter Weinzierl. Why was he charged with offenses to do with Brazil and not Ukraine? Well, on the one hand, it could be that the FBI and DOJ just do not want to touch Ukraine. That's entirely possible. But on the other hand, it may also be that his involvement is hard to prove. Sure, it's awfully suspicious that the offshore entities which were being funded via correspondence accounts opened by Ukrainian banks kept defaulting on their loans. But does that prove money laundering on Peter Weinzierl's part? What is certain is that this story once again shows how disastrous Biden's stewardship of post-coup Ukraine really was. Now, we don't know whether he personally profited from these schemes, but what is certain is that many others did profit while Biden was supposedly in charge. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.